So we've got this increasingly democratic socialist of America movement on the left. I'm sure we'll see more of that as time goes on. We also now are seeing a civil war on the right, which exploded last week in particular over the fact that Tucker Carlson had this white nationalist called Nick Fuentes on his show. And then there is a big debate now going on, in which you're one of the participants, about whether the right should turn a blind eye to the fact that its fringe is becoming increasingly Nazi-ish, or whether there's a break that needs to be made to prevent what happened on the woke left, or rather because of the woke left on the left, where the extremists took over, wore the skin of the entire thing, and then were punished very severely electorally over a period of time. Give us your perspective on that.
Sure. I mean, I've been arguing against this for quite a while. I think that last week was a pretty good sort of indicator that there is a bleed over from a series of terrible ideas into the more mainstream area. The problem is not, of course, that Tucker Carlson, it's a free country. He can interview whomever he damn well pleases. It is not, in fact, cancellation to criticize somebody's interview tactics. And it's not even that he interviewed Fuentes. It's that he proceeded to massage Nick Fuentes. I mean, he treated him with kid gloves. He did not ask him a single difficult question. He did not press him on any of his extraordinary statements about, for example, Tucker's friend Charlie Kirk, or Tucker's friend J.D. Vance, or his wife, or any of that. And he simply brought him on and then proceeded to gloss him. And the fact that that was treated in some quarters as sort of normal is, I think, a very serious problem. I think that it's a moral problem because, frankly, I do not think that you ought to be glossing people with terrible views, whether or not they are your friends or whether or not you go fishing together. And as public figures, I think that people have a responsibility to actually say when bad things are happening on your own side. And I also think that, there is an attempt to not only pretend it away, but in some cases embrace it with this sort of no enemies to my right, or our coalition must stand together or we'll lose. And I think that's bad pragmatically. I don't think that's even true. I think that what we've watched here is, everybody's celebrating Zohar Mamdani winning in New York. In New York, okay? Like, this place is 127% Democrat. So, it's like when people say, AOC is going to be a national candidate. Maybe she will be, or maybe she won in Brooklyn. And maybe Abigail Spanberger is going to be a better candidate for the Democrats because she ran in Virginia and won. And Virginia seems to be more representative of the body politic, broadly speaking, across America than New York, which is a pretty closed circuit. The idea on the right that if you must gloss Nazis in order to win, if they start to become, if the face of the Republican Party continues to move in a direction that is racialist, that is religiously exclusivist to the extent that it seems to be moving, if that is the way that the Republican Party decides to play it, that is not an electorally sound strategy, just on a pragmatic level. I don't see, like, these are not, the American people do not like the politics of, say, Nick Fuentes. And the attempt to launder his ideas into the public view, which is what I think Tucker has been doing with a wide variety of rather nefarious characters over the course of the last 2 years. I don't think those laundered views are particularly popular with the American people. And so if the right wants to pretend like, moving in that direction is going to win them additional votes, not the number of votes you're going to lose by moving in this particular direction.
People might say Tucker Carlson's got the biggest conservative platform in America. Isn't that proof that actually these views are very popular? I
mean, they are popular with a certain segment. Are they popular broad scale across America? I mean, I know many ambulatory psychotics who have very large audiences in the online space. I'm not calling Tucker an ambulatory psychotic. I think he's very actually coherent in what he's doing. But I know a lot of people who have a big audience. We should note that every big audience in the media, you're talking about 3-4 million people. The electorate in the United States is generally about 160 million people. And so you can find, it's a big country. You can find a niche for anything. I think one of the mistakes politicians make is they look at X and they say, this is representative of the American body politic. And that is just too online. It's just way too online. I mean, just to take one obvious example, Tucker Carlson was very much opposed to President Trump's strike on the Iranian nuclear facility and said that it was going to break MAGA. That was a 90-10 proposition in the opposite way for President Trump by all polling data among the Republicans. Republicans were very much pro that. And so, but if you'd read Twitter, then you would have gotten precisely the opposite impression. And so I think being too online is one aspect of this for sure.
Ben, but we talk about being too online, and I take your point. However, what is undeniable is that the online world bleeds into the real
Absolutely.
world, which we saw with wokeism. And partly the reason that wokeism grew so powerful, in my opinion, is a dearth of courage and integrity on the left. where they saw the extremists run rampant and nobody was going to say, stood up and went, hang on, this is nonsense, stop doing that. And now I'm seeing the same thing happen on the right with exceptions like people like yourself. And I'm going, are we not just seeing the mirror image of what happened in 2014, 2015?
I mean, I think we are, and it's very, very concerning to me. I mean, I'm encouraged that I think there are a lot of people who have been coming out and saying that this is not appropriate, that this is not something that you can quote unquote side with or unify with, and I think that's good. But I do agree that one of the polarized aspects of American politics is this idea that as long as you're quote unquote on my side, and we don't actually define what on my side means based on, say, principle. We instead define it based on what we supposedly oppose. But even then, we don't necessarily oppose the same things. But we kind of broadly just throw up our hands. They're on my side. They're on my side. And that dynamic leads to polarized sides where, I mean, the future of this, if the more radical wings were to win on the right and the more radical wing continues to win on the left, you end up with an electoral future that looks essentially red versus brown, right? And that's not an electoral future, I think, that's good for any American, especially because the vast majority of Americans are neither of those things and don't like either of those things.
And look, we can dress it up, oh, they're on my side, but let's talk about what it really is. It's about you not wanting to be ostracized by your own team. It's about you not wanting to lose viewers, followers, influence. So you take the path that is easy for you, but ultimately destructive not only for the conservative movement, but America as a whole.
I mean, I think that is right. I do. And I think that is an easy path to ensuring that you, quote unquote, don't lose people, but I don't think that it's a good path for not losing the country. And I think that if you lose your soul, then you end up losing the country. Again, the things that I've fought for, let's put it this way. I've been doing this for a very long time. I started writing a syndicated column when I was 17 years old. I don't know that there's anybody who's been following me for any period of time who's ever said, whatever happened to the views of that Ben Shapiro? He's really morphed. He's really changed. Well, what happened? Like, I don't get that question ever, but I don't think you could say the same about Tucker. I mean, I think that's one of the most common questions about Tucker. It's like, what changed? What happened? And so I think, that's a relevant question. And pretending that people haven't morphed or that shouldn't have any impact on the public discourse, of course it does. The things that, that's literally our job, is to talk about these issues. And if you talk about the issues in a different way, it seems to me that earns a different response.
One of the people that seems to disagree with, I don't know if this is exactly true, but seems to be based on what I'm reading, is Matt Walsh, who of course is your colleague at the Daily Wire. How are you going to negotiate that situation? I
mean, listen, at the Daily Wire, we have a wide variety of views on a wide variety of subject. Matt is free to have his opinion. I think he's wrong. I'm sure he thinks I'm wrong. And that is what it is. I also noticed that Matt is not glossing Nick Fuentes.
No, he's not. And this is what I was going to ask you about as well. Where does this idea come from? Because, look, I completely agree with you. Anyone is entitled to have anyone on the show that they want. We've invited Nick Fuentes on the show. We would treat him very differently, I think, than Tucker would. We would have a conversation with him and push on some of the things that he's said. We haven't heard anything back. But where does this idea come from that if I say the person you had on your show is someone whose values I don't agree with, and I don't like the way you conducted the interview, that is cancellation?
Yeah, I mean,
when did that happen?
I think it's a really low resolution response to what probably was a low resolution description of cancellation in the first place. So I think that if you were going to look at sort of the etymology of what happened here, it seems to me that the left shut the Overton window so unbelievably tight that if you said, for example, a man is not a woman, this meant that you had to be socially ostracized. And I think that's what people mean when they say cancellation. The free speech concerns typically are about being banned from platforms. Cancellation is the idea of social ostracism, that you must be invited to the party. And so for a while, it was like you couldn't be invited to any party, or people would attempt to go after your career if you said things that were kind of baseline normalcy. And the response on the right was not, let's broaden the Overton window. It was, let's eviscerate the Overton window. Now, almost a morally relativistic response. All views are now to be treated as perfectly equivalent. And if you act with scorn at any view, then that must be a form of cancellation. That must be a form of social ostracization that is unjustifiable. And so what you end up with is this sort of bizarre math where the right has taken to the idea that if you get a lot of flack, it's because you're over the target. And also that if you criticize, then that's a form of cancellation, that's a form of social ostracization. Well, if you add those two things together, what you come up with is it is probably better to be a Nazi than to criticize a Nazi. Because if you're a Nazi, then you're taking a lot of flack, which must mean that you're over the target. And if someone criticizes you, then they're engaging in the same sort of politically correct cancellation that the left was engaging in. you must be right, they must be wrong, and they're canceling you, and they're violative of sort of basic First Amendment principles. So I think that's a really low resolution view. I think the argument about cancellation was not that nobody should ever be socially ostracized. It was that the idea set that was being socially ostracized was a very normie, mainstream set of views. And I'm not a moral relativist. I don't believe all views are equivalently moral or decent or worthy of, or even worthy of response. I think this idea that you're not allowed to have scorn for views that you believe are damaging or deeply immoral, like truly bad. Like, for example, not even arguments, just statements. Like, Nick Fuentes calling J.D. Vance's wife a Jeet. Like, that's not an argument. Or like, how are you supposed to respond to the argument that he has made, for example, that J.D. Vance is a fat gay race traitor who shouldn't be president of the United States because he's in an intermarriage? Am I allowed to respond to scorn? I feel like scorn is a pretty good response to that, and that doesn't actually deserve a debate or a fulsome discussion, and that in fact treating that as though that is a rational idea is a disservice to rationality. But if you treat all forms of that response as cancellation, that's probably how you get to this math.
And of course, one of the other things that happened, and I think the woke left deserves all the scorn and blame for this, is what they've done to words. I see people now saying, well, how dare you call Nick Fuentes a Nazi? I'm going, well, I'm not insulting him. I am describing his views.
Correct. I mean, there's been an attempt, because the left has overused all of these terms, they've now become meaningless. And that means that when you do that, in the rhetorical space, you actually end up destroying the systemic immunity that people have to bad things.
Exactly.
So if you call everything racist, then the response typically is, okay, nothing's racist. But that's not true. We know that some things are actually racist. If you say that black people are innately inferior, that's racist, right? That's a racist statement. But if I say racist, there's a group of people who will immediately say, well, no, you're just using racist as a club in order to shut down conversation because the left used it in that way. And so a sort of Pavlovian response has developed where if you use a term the way it's properly supposed to be used, then it's treated the same as if you were improperly using the term. So the term itself loses all meaning. And then, I guess we have to re-argue that issue. I mean, I guess that's the idea. But again, some of these are not arguments. Some of these are impulses or emotional outbursts or insults or trollery. And so that's not an honest conversation. That's not a discussion.
Did you know that the biggest threat to your retirement is not something that's talked about often? The increased longevity of American citizens means default retirement accounts like IRAs, 401ks, and TSPs may not suffice. If you have over $50,000 in your retirement account, get instant access to a free 2-minute report from Augusta Precious Metals that reveals the one step you can take to secure your financial future. Visit triggergold.com or text TRIGGER to 35052 today. We talked about Tucker, and one of the things is quite clear that, as you say, there's been a direction of travel change very significantly since he left Fox and started doing what he's doing. He's hosted a whole number of people that clearly are pushing a particular worldview. I think that's fair to say. What do you think he's up to with that?
I don't like to attribute inauthenticity to people, so I will assume that it's reflective of his actual worldviews. I think that, just looking at the guests that he's had and sort of the views that he has laundered, because that seems to be his mode of doing business. It's that he very rarely says the thing that he wants to say out loud. A few times he will. Like, for example, in the Fuentes interview, he'll say that Christian Zionists have a brain disease, right? That's him actually saying the thing that he thinks, then sort of trying later to half buy it back as he realized he crossed a politically inconvenient line for him.
I mean, all people I know personally who I've seen be seized by this brain virus, and they're not Jewish. Most of them are self-described Christians, and then the Christian Zionists who are, Christian Zionists. Like, what is that?
Right.
And I can just say for myself, I dislike them more than anybody. Because what? Because it's Christian heresy, and I'm offended by that as a Christian.
But mostly what he does is he has on people, and then that's fascinating. That's very interesting. Now, of course, Tucker is perfectly capable of carrying out a very adversarial interview, as he did with, for example, Ted Cruz. And so pretending that he's not doing that thing is, I think, insulting to the intelligence. And the right would not accept it in any other context. If a reporter has on Kamala Harris and asks her 0 difficult questions except how brat she is, then we are rightly going to assume that reporter is pro-Kamala Harris, right? And it's not doing their actual journalistic job, and you can sort of intuit views that way. Guest selection is definitely a big one. How you treat your guests is a big one. We can sort of intuit the views. I think that Tucker's general belief from looking at the way he has done his sort of foreign policy talk is that it's not just that America is overextended, it's that America is a sort of nefarious force in the world, and wherever American support for allies happens, then it must be the result of domestic manipulations, and that the most important thing right now is to essentially go autarkic, to bring, I think this is the most charitable read, to bring, American resources home, to not be involved in the world in any way. And most importantly, that anybody who opposes this agenda is a tool of a foreign agenda, or is a malign actor, which is the thing that differentiates, I think, some of how Tucker does his business from others. I think Tucker is very fond of using emotivism, where he attributes motive to people in order to not even debunk the argument, but simply to just say, they're a bad person, they hate you, they want to hurt your children, and I despise them. I despise them comes up a lot on his show, which I've always found kind of strange. Like, I don't know why that's an argument. Why are your feelings even sort of relevant to the point that you're making? It's a sort of strange political take. I despise. I mean, who cares? And I despise lots of things. I mean, broccoli is not my favorite. Like, of what relevance is this?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. And whenever I hear Tucker, I listen to him, there does seem to be it kind of reminds me of like a failed romantic. He had this romanticized idea of America and what America was. He's now fallen out of love. And like a guy who's gone through his first breakup, he looks at his girlfriend and goes, oh, she's a massive bitch.
I mean, I think that I think that probably he would agree with that on America's foreign policy. I think he talks about this openly about, for example, the war in Iraq, but I think that he's been critical of pretty much every American foreign policy decision since World War II, including World War II. I mean, really, including World War II, right? I mean, he has on guests who have said repeatedly, not just one, multiple guests who have said that either America took the wrong side in World War II or the true villain of World War II was Winston Churchill. He himself has said, what did Churchill actually gain? Because now London is a terrible place, which is sort of like saying that there's litter in the streets of New York, therefore the Enlightenment was bad. It's like clearly he thinks something went fundamentally wrong with the West around the time that World War II happened. And why he's saying that and what is the viewpoint that defines that? I think he's sort of left that undefined, so I'll leave that undefined. All I'll say is I think that it's untrue. I think that some of the views, many of the views of the people that he brings on run counter to traditional American conservatism at the very, very least.
Look, the brilliant thing about social media and podcasting is that there's no gatekeepers. The terrible thing about social media and podcasting is there's no gatekeepers. And when you look at people like Tucker and you look at people like Candace, when they were in large organizations and they had to report to people, there were guardrails and they couldn't go off the reservation. Whereas now they can go off the reservation and we've seen what's happened.
I mean, again, I think that it's not even a matter of gatekeepers as much as it is of a willingness to sort of be checked by people and listen to maybe better judgment. Because I think that there's a case to be made that many of the gatekeepers have sucked and getting rid of some of the gatekeepers was good. But I think that what is required of consumers of information now is significantly more than was required of consumers of information 15, 20 years ago.
You have to be your own gatekeeper now.
Yeah, and most people are not really good at that. It's not even a matter of qualification, it's just they're not very good at it. Because again, you're consuming information like a fire hose, and it's coming at you on social media from an algorithm that I think is quite perverse in places like X or on Reddit or wherever you are, TikTok. And so unless you are a very informed person to begin with, it's very difficult to know what sources to trust. And that's when you get into a bit of confirmation bias. And that's where we get back to sort of the original point that we were making, which is the people who pander most strongly to your sensibilities, which is that you have been wronged by some sort of conspiratorial coterie of people who are aiming to crush you underfoot. That's a very flattering idea, because then the idea is that you're not responsible for any of your own actions and that all solutions are just simple if only you had the power to implement them.
And you also get incentivized to create this type of content, because the more of this kind of conspiratorial content, let's just call it that you make, the more likely people are to engage with it, because they're thinking to themselves, oh, this is interesting, this is dangerous, I want to hear what he's
well, secret's being uncovered. Whenever a secret is being uncovered, that's much more interesting than somebody saying, hey, there's no secret, everybody's bad at their job. which, by the way, is actually significantly more accurate. In virtually all circumstances, people are just not good at things who think they were going to be good at things, and then the results are bad. But it's much more sexy if you say, no, there's a nefarious secret. There's a group that meets in secret and they get together just to f*** you.
Yeah.
right? That's flattering to your sense of self. It's flattering to your sense of the world. And now you're part of an informed group of people who really know the thing that nobody else knows.
Well, that's very true. And I think another piece, and I wrote about this on my Substack, I don't know if you saw, but it was about what's happened to young men in particular over the last 10, 15 years, where we had this woke period where if you were a straight white man, there was dog shit, and then straight white men a lot of levels below that. And particularly for a generation who neither created a system where men may have had some advantage or white people may have had some advantage, nor benefited from that. If you were a 15-year-old Zoomer, you were being told the future's female, all men are trash, etc., while actually your life outcomes and the education system, which was overwhelmingly not favorable to people like you that you were going through, you can kind of see why they're angry and resentful.
I mean, I totally agree why they're angry and resentful. And this, again, gets back to a point. Diagnosis is easy. Prognosis and cure is hard.
Yeah.
And so I totally agree that the sort of wokeism of the past 20 years has created, for example, the Fuentes movement. I mean, I talked about that openly on the show on Monday and in the piece that I wrote for the Wall Street Journal, is that basically the sort of woke left idea that white Christian men in particular were the scourge of the earth and thus had to be extirpated from public life, or at least disadvantaged in public life by the sort of Ibram X. Kendi. The only way to fix the injustices of the past is to engage in injustices in the present. I can see why that would drive a sort of white Christian identitarianism. I think that in order for that identitarianism to take place, it can't really be a Christian identitarianism, because Christianity, last I checked, and again, I'll let others who are more expert in this topic than I speak to this, is a system that distinguishes neither Jew from Greek nor slave from master. Right? I mean, the idea is that all are equal it's about individual equality was one of the key functions of Christianity. So you have to come up with kind of a pseudo-Christianity where, certain people are superior to other people. And I think that that's a really negative thing, which is why you've seen some systemic immunity to it among more traditional Christian groups, actually. But I think that the move that you see, it is understandable, but the normal curative to woke should be meritocracy. And that's a hard argument to make these days. Right? I mean, again, because meritocracy has an inherent suggestion, which is if you don't succeed, maybe it's at least partially or largely your fault. And that's a very hard sell to people. That's a very hard sell.